This is WPSL Port St. Lucie, the talk of the Treasure Coast.
It's 11:07 at WPSL 1590, the talk of the Treasure Coast, also on Alexa and Google Home. And it's time for Ask the Rabbi.
And this is Rabbi Shafir Lobb of Congregation Eitz Chayim in Port St. Lucie, Florida. Welcome to the show, and really thrilled that you're listening in or watching on Facebook or watching on YouTube or listening on Alexa or Google Home, any of those great ways that you can hear WPSL. And if you'd like to ask me a question, please give me a call at 772-340-1590. And it's a great morning. It was a wonderful morning walk-in. It was nice and a little bit cooler than it's been. A little more humid, but, you know, who's counting? And now we've got start live on two things. I can be twice on live. I guess I will try that. Why don't you type in Ask a Rabbi with the date on the top of that, and then we'll flip it up and start it.
Multi-television
Multi-televisioning, right? Yeah, what can I say? So I was listening to your show, and you were talking about a couple of things. I'm going to point out one subtle thing that I heard, which was kind of interesting. Somebody was talking about, here we go. Okay, so it's starting here. And now I've got two live things. Oh, boy, I don't even know how to do this one because that's a new thing. So go ahead and finish that one off if you would. Stuart, thank you. Stuart's with me this morning. And, wow, I am really big in that screen. So, okay. The joys of modern technology. And the frog gets to hold it. There we go. A little bit tilted. And so this is all the things that you're supposed to do before you go live, but we're doing it as we speak, because that's how we fly. So, again, I was going to pick up something that I did hear on your show that had me, it was a very subtle little thing. Somebody was talking about how wonderful we are at getting along together. And I will say that for the most part, most Americans do get along, but there was a really subtle little point. The person said there were Americans and Spanish people. Now, I don't know about you, but I know an awful lot of Hispanic, Latino folks that are, in fact, American.
Something that actually went right over my head.
And that's not surprising. No offense, Stuart, but you're a white male.
I haven't looked in the mirror lately.
What can I say? But that's the subtlety, right? That's the subtlety of privilege, right? This idea that something is quote unquote normal when in fact the norm is in fact a mosaic, and always has been. There have been people of all ethnicities, all religions, all traditions, all colors, all shapes that have been part of the American fabric since we took it over from the folks who really lived here. Okay? And some of those folks have been lucky enough to have been part of it. But we really
they would say we're the first Americans.
Well, I have a cartoon.
In Canada, they call them the First Nation.
And we call them First Nation sometimes too, although they actually prefer to be called American Indian, that was news to me that I didn't realize, but I learned that over the course of time, and I'm sure that varies from individual to individual. But and things like that change. Right, because at one time, blacks didn't want to be called blacks, and sometimes they want to be called African Americans. Sometimes Jews want to be called Jews. Sometimes they want to be called Hebrews. Right, everybody's got different names and different labels at different times. And the thing that's really happening now that I think is kind of exciting is that we're starting to see more hybrid identities, so that somebody's not defining themselves along one characteristic, but in fact, they're incorporating multiple parts in order to meet the various needs of their persona. And I think that's actually healthy. The better we do it at integrating those multifaceted identities, the better that we're going to interweave the fabric of our country. And we've always been all different things. It's just we've kind of like tamped down parts of us. And
so how do you make inroads to, let's not say the most rabid, but how do you make inroads to those who are just following the rabid?
the sheep. The
Okay,
sheep and the
yes.
goats. I think that's a valid question, and it's an important point. One of the things, and I always bring up stuff from Tucson because I did a lot of those kinds of things in Tucson. There was a program there called Unlearning Racism. And, and that was actually aimed at, those of us who would like to think that we're less racist than everybody else. But, you and I have had that discussion, right? When you first walked in and saw a woman on the bima, it jarred you. It set your teeth on edge. That's sexism. As much as I love you, that's sexism.
You're right.
And sometimes I am. And that comment of Americans and others, or as I like to sometimes say, guys and people. But
But before let me interject one other example, and I've mentioned this to you before. When I was in college at Rutgers, we were across the river over at Livingston, which was established in the 70s as for basically minorities and first-generation college students. Mm-hmm. And there was one point, just by happenstance, I went into the main cafeteria for dinner, and every single face in there was black. I turned around and I left. I was uncomfortable.
Because you felt different.
Right. Now I practice discrimination law and civil rights. Now, I don't think those two things are completely unrelated. As I walked away, I knew what I was doing was wrong. I consciously knew it was wrong. Yeah. That there was no reason for me to automatically just leave because there wasn't a face in there that looked like me.
Right.
But I felt very uncomfortable, and I did it. And it's been how many years, decades ago? But I still feel bad about it.
So I'm going to tell you two stories that are a little bit connected to that. Okay. And where do you have this on? Do you have this on my Facebook?
Wherever you said, yes, on yours.
Okay. What was I going to say? I'm going to tell two stories. One was I was, 12, no, probably 13. I think it was a little bit after my bat mitzvah. And my niece was with me. My niece was, like 2-3 years old. She was a little thing. And so I could probably calculate what my age is, but I'm significantly older than she is. And, but not a full generation, a half generation. And, we were standing outside an A&P. This'll really.
I remember A&Ps.
Yeah, in Philadelphia, and we had loaded the groceries in my mother's car. And when we shut the door on the groceries, she drove away, leaving my niece and me standing on the curb.
These days, she'd be arrested.
Well, we knew. Well, I was old enough to be in charge of my niece. And in fact, a lot of people asked me if she was mine, which, I'm not even going to touch that whole subject. But we're standing there, and, there's nothing for us to do.
Well, you didn't have a cell phone?
No, we didn't have cell phones back then. It was before Star Trek. And and so we're standing there, and there's a black woman who's also apparently waiting for somebody to go to the parking lot, bring the car up, and put her groceries in the car. And my niece, whom I had not realized, but apparently had grown to her, grand old age of 2 or 3, and apparently lived in an all-white neighborhood. Now, that's kind of surprising because her dad was military, and there certainly were blacks on the base. But on the part where they lived, apparently there weren't in the trailer court. And they lived in a trailer court. And she looks at me and she says, "That lady's chocolate." And I'm like, okay, Earth, open up, swallow me whole right now. Right? Because here I am, a kid, trying to take care of this big mouth little thing. And thank God the woman was this angel who looked at us and said, "Would you like to touch me?" And she came down. She went on her, she crouched down as if not on her knees, but, that level, and let my niece touch her. And I was blown away by that. needless to say, impressed beyond words. And I think it had a good impact on my niece. And then the next thing that happened along the lines is somewhat similar to what you had. And Jeff, we see you're on the line. I'll get to you in a minute. Let me just finish this story. And we were in D.C. We were poor newlyweds, my husband and I. And we wanted to do a weekend or part of a week, half of a week or something in D.C. And we looked down the list, and we picked the cheapest recognizable Holiday Inn or a chain.
No, you probably know what you picked.
And, so we're a little bit out in the boonies, and we said, okay, that's no big deal. There's Subway, and we looked at the Subway route, and, we'll do this, and we knew we had to take a bus to the Subway and then the Subway into town, and we figured that the half price on the hotel room was well worth that. We weren't going to take our car into D.C. We wanted to leave it. In fact, we might even have flown. I don't remember exactly how we got to D.C. No, I think we drove. But we didn't want to take the car into D.C. And so early in the morning, we go to the bus station, and there's nobody there. We apparently just missed a bus. And we're standing there, and a couple of people, start to come up, and a couple more people come up, and some more people come up. And after a while, Bill and I kind of look at each other, and we realize that we're the only light-colored folks in the group.
You're in the southeast part of D.C.?
Yeah, well, I don't remember exactly where we were in D.C. And we go to the Subway, and, everybody on the bus besides us was African-American. We get to the Subway, everybody getting on the Subway is African-American. And we go into town, and it's like there's like a curtain change at a couple of stops, and all the blacks get off and whites get on. And it was kind of an interesting experience. And we drive on in, do our things in D.C., come back the Subway, and sure enough, the other change happens, and it becomes black again. We, come out of the Subway station, get on the bus, and again, we look around, and we're the only white faces on the bus. And, I'm not going to say that it made me feel uncomfortable, but it made me feel very obvious. Right, very, very noticeable. And sure enough, a little kid turned to their mommy and said, "Mommy, those people are white or pink or whatever color she said." I don't remember if it was a color. But she pointed at us, and I modeled what that other woman had modeled for me. "Thank you, woman, angel," in the past. And I said, "Would you like to touch me?" And the little girl came over and touched me. And I was so thrilled to be able to model that same behavior and hope that it, in fact, waves out and that people start to discover we're humans. We're humans. I went to an integrated school. I was in grade school in California. It was already integrated by the time I got there. So, yeah, no, not as surprising a deal.
All of
for
our
me.
schools in Los Angeles were integrated.
Yeah.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, California was one of the first. And Jeff on line 1, thank you for calling.
Well, you helped me make my point. My point was there was a soft message coming over the wire, but somebody had to catch something. And that's what I said about, when people, take something like that and they try to expand out on it to make it something that it's really not. It was just an indicative statement of somebody that may be from Honduras or Guatemala, but their heritage was Spanish. But I'll let you respond. But that's the reason why I used that word. But maybe I was wrong. But then again, let's go to that point to take that when the message wasn't even anything about that. It was just about people from different cultures, people from different countries, people from different everything.
And
where's the big picnic where we can all go and hang out and have fun?
Jeff,
you know what I'm saying?
Jeff, I love the message that you said that people get along. And I hope that you heard that I said that I liked that part of the message. What I was trying to speak to is how subtle that other piece is in that it's pervasive in the culture. It's, and I know that you don't mean anything wrong. I know that you don't.
You think that they take offense by being indicated, being called that? Because I can't tell you how many people that I come in and pat me on my back, and they're my Spanish friend.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? And they'll say, and I speak Spanish, so it's like,
Good.
and then they'll laugh with me because my Spanish is so horrible. Because when I grew up in Panama, I forgot most of it, but I try.
I hear you. I have forgotten a lot of the Spanish I spoke in California.
Yeah, and it's like, and it's a fun thing. And then I have to jig them or poke them a little bit and make them chuckle a little bit. Well, we're in America. We're going to speak English today. And they'll look and they'll laugh at me and they'll, everybody picks on each other.
I hear you, Jeff. And there's clearly a difference between somebody who is, say, a registered alien and somebody who's an American, whether they're naturalized. I'll get the word right yet here, or native born. They're still Americans. Once they have citizenship, they're Americans, right?
Yeah. Well,
to the extent that the laws change, because like treason, you kind of have to be an American to do treason. Otherwise, it's just enemy action.
Oh, that's yeah.
Okay.
Still,
so there's
yeah,
there are distinctions, and I wouldn't have said anything had you said white or Hispanic, because there's a slight shade difference, right? We can visually cue.
I hate color.
I understand that, but there's also
I'm a musician. I don't see color.
There's a sidebar though. I'm gonna play devil's advocate with you, Jeff, because you're being good-natured, and I appreciate that. But even being colorblind in some cases is to not be sensitive to the needs of others. I'll give you an example of something that happened with me. I was driving, I had gone to a meeting with somebody, and I'd given somebody a lift, and that somebody happened to be a black male. Okay, and he was in the car with me, and we'd gone to the meeting, and we were coming home, and there was a cop behind us on the road who flashed his lights, and I forget what I said, but it was something about, well, if we pull over, I can't imagine that we've done anything, and this guy is going ballistic next to me. And it took me a few minutes to realize that
he was scared.
He was scared because it was, riding while black, right? Not even driving while black, which is, an automatic sin for some cops. And that's not to say that all cops are bad, and
No,
you can't make any of those generalizations, but there certainly have been enough incidences for this man who was probably in his 50s at that point. He'd had enough experiences in a car being black that he was scared. He was terrified of a cop pulling us over. Whereas for me, it was just like, oh well, all right.
What the hell? What'd I do?
Yeah, well, I knew I hadn't done anything wrong. I really didn't think, and it wasn't us. He went to the car in front of us when I started to pull over, and this black is just about ready to crawl under the dashboard and hide, and I realized that being colorblind was to be not sensitive to his fears.
Right.
So it's a double-edged sword. Everything carries another piece.
That's sad.
Yeah, it is. We're one race. We're one human race. The amount of genetic material that governs our skin color and our facial features is very, very, very minute. It's a tiny, tiny fraction. If we were to take the human genome and map it across an average classroom, and I do that, I mention this in my classes, the amount of genetic material that governs facial color and features is less than the tip of your little finger.
I gotta pick up Ashley.
So, all righty. Well, I appreciate it, Jeff. Thank you for calling, and thank you for being good-natured about it too. So, I'll go to another very popular little item on that. It had come up in your two callers about folks that are transgender and folks that have different orientations. And it's amazing to me how many kids, take biology in high school and do not learn in their genetics piece that yes, 80 to 90% of the population is either XX or XY, but 10 to 15%, or maybe more, are some other variation, whether it's XXY, XYY, XXX. I mean, there's like a myriad number of possibilities of those two chromosomes, not just the two. We're not binary. And so when you get off of that XY binaryism, the whole world changes. Some of those folks are born with both sets of genitalia. So, and the doctor makes a decision, or the parents make a decision. They make a decision whether they, whatever they do. They have to make a decision that most of the rest of the world doesn't do. There's also other conditions that have to do with hormones and things like that, where, for example, a male may present with a very small penis. And historically, doctors have turned that person into a female, rather than have them, quote unquote, be embarrassed by having a small penis. There's actually a guy in Australia who's very public about it because his parents refused to allow the surgery. And he's married and he's fine. And he's like, my life would have been very, very different had the doctor been allowed to castrate me and turn me into a female. And, I was mentioning this in one of my classes at the college when we do our gender unit, and gender and orientation identities and things like that. And the kids were like, why don't we learn that? They wanted to know why did they have to come to a college class to learn that these variations exist? And I think that's an interesting question, right? Why, are the textbooks lying? Not necessarily, but, less than a whole truth is not necessarily the truth. All right, so if you're missing big details, we're creating an attitude among children that things are binary when they're not. It's really just part of the human spectrum. And that's what we've learned over time. And if you think that people whose orientation is different voluntarily want to be tortured for it, then you're not very much in tune with people. Why would somebody do something that constantly causes them stress and grief? And it's because that's the way their bodies are wired. And so one of my students piped up with something I've heard elsewhere, and you're going to chuckle, and that's that God, that's implying that God makes a mistake.
The mistake theory.
The mistake theory, and it's not God made a mistake. Even though I'm perfectly convinced that God made a mistake, I was supposed to be 5'7" and thin, right? And clearly I'm not. That's not God's mistake. That's just the roll of the dice of the genetics. It's the system that God created, so God's responsible, but in a CEO kind of way, not because God, put God's finger and said, "You will be 5'2" and fat."
That's not the same thing, Rabbi.
You've got all the people with heart defects. You've got folks with hormone imbalances. You've got, God knows, people with mental illness that is part of how they're wired, right? It's not just the way they were raised, but it's in fact, they were predisposed to be that way. Did God make a mistake there? That's one that I've yelled at God about. And I'm still not, I don't fully understand why people have to suffer like that. But that's where my faith comes in and says, who am I to think I have to understand the universe in its entirety when I'm only a human? I don't have the whole story. But I do, in my heart of hearts, believe that God doesn't make junk. And that therefore, if I go with that premise as my starting point, then there must be a reason for all of the myriad things of the spectrums of all of it, that's part of what that person needs to work with, to learn, and to use to make their contribution to the world. Because that's one of our needs, right? We all have these basic human needs. And, whether we use Maslow's hierarchy or somebody else's, the one that I like to use is that we all need to know, we need to be certain that we're alive. We've got to be pretty confident of that. So, not afraid that the walls are going to cave in, that we do have a meal. Once we have that, then we want, something more than peanut butter and jelly for lunch. We want variety, right? And then we also want to be significant. We want to be important to at least a couple of people. At least one other person, maybe a dog, but somebody. We want to have some significance. And then we also want to have love and connection. A lot of people don't go for love because it's hard, it's scary, and they'll settle for connection and companionship. But those are the basic day-to-day needs. Beyond that, we've got a need to grow and learn. Our species is automatically curious. And then we need to use that information in order to give back and be something bigger than ourselves. And that's part of why we form communities. It's part of why we have faith communities. So those things, we can only work with the challenges that we have in our lives, right? So part of what made me sensitive is probably that I'm female, and I did live and have Drexel Institute tell me they'd love to have me if I wasn't a woman, if I wasn't a girl. They didn't even say a woman. If you weren't a girl, we'd love to admit you. And I don't know how my life would have been different had I gone to Drexel. But that door was closed to me because behind closed doors they could say to me, "You're a girl."
Now, do they have women now?
Sure they do.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Okay, dating myself, right? I'm on the edge. I was at the beginning of woman's lib, and it was a time when people said things behind closed doors that they wouldn't even risk saying behind closed doors today, because you might have one of those new things called a cell phone, and you might set it on voice memo, and walk outside, and people could recognize their voice, and even if you couldn't take it to court, you could certainly embarrass the living daylights out of them. And so we do live in a different kind of a world, and it's an interesting. This is different. So I don't think God makes a mistake when somebody says, I really am closer to identifying with how the society in which I live defines women, or I'm closer to how our society defines men, because part of what's male and female is cultural, right? It's very much cultural, and it is somewhat species dependent, right? Seahorses, the guys get to carry the kids, right? It's the male that nurtures the babies and gives birth. Try that, humans. And in the lions, the males just hang around, and as one of my little students, I also teach Chinese students English. One of them said to me very intelligently, I was very pleased, it's one of my older students, said, "The males don't hunt. When they're hungry, they roar, and the women go out and hunt." And it's right. In the lion, you never see a picture of a male lion hunting. It's always the female who's hunting. Otherwise, he couldn't have his big mane. That would be a big detriment for hunting. Right, so a lion with a big...
Cuts down on the wind speed.
Well, and it also cuts down on a lot of other crud that gets on the mane.
Yeah.
And so, right, so that's part of signaling. That lion is signaling that he's got women to take care of him because he can grow this luxurious mane. And he's got plenty of food. What can I say? Animals are interesting. And we learn a lot if we watch animals and see what they do, and then turn around and watch the two-legged animals. Yeah, I once
what we can learn from our dog.
Yes, well, one of my less tactful moments at a meeting when I was in corporate America, when I'd really just had it with the guys strutting and turfing, because I was not very tactful back then. And I looked at them and I said, I watch my male dogs do that in the backyard. I don't need to see it in the meeting. Yeah, it did not endear me to the males in the room. but it was so apropos.
That's great. That's great.
So what can I say?
So how long were you there after that?
I was there for quite a while, but I was not known for being tactful. Something I've learned a little bit more of along the way. So, but that's really where I come from. You talked about our congregation being started on the idea that what matters is what you do in the community, not what color you are, what shape you are, what orientation you are, what gender you are. None of that matters, and that's true. And that's because I don't believe that God makes junk. I believe that each of us has challenges and things that we have to work through. But no, God didn't make a mistake if somebody needs to reassign their gender. Maybe society's making a mistake in making genders a little too rigid. That's a whole different issue. And that I do believe. I do believe our society is so anti-female, and I'm going to go out there and I'm going to say that, is so anti-female that we are threatened if women want equality with men.
How could that be when women are like 52% of the population?
That's a good question because women have imbibed the Kool-Aid.
We have more women in Congress now than any other time. More freshman women in Congress now.
It's the fact that they're freshmen. Hello. That should tell you something right there.
It's time to move to Iceland. The story, it was a lead story on Fox News.
I thought it was Norway.
Women, was it Norway? No.
The happiest country in the world?
No. This is Iceland, who they passed a law, equal pay.
That's a step in the right direction. Right, women make less money than men on the average, right? And one of our noble politicians just said, one of the dangers in America right now is shrinking male income. Hello. Right? Shrinking male income, in other words, that men are not making enough more than women. Hello. You want to talk about a subtle, not so subtle sexism, right? And other things. So here's another piece that tells you, right, if a little boy acts like, well, let's start with a little girl. If a little girl acts like a little boy, we call her a tomboy or something like that, and it's okay. Nobody looks at her like there's anything wrong. But if a little boy acts very girly, there isn't one nice word that he's called. Not one nice word. And that's a clue. That's not about gender, except that it's about sexism. If it was okay to be female, I don't think there'd be half of this stress of people reassigning their genders, but there also wouldn't be as much need because I think that genders would be more fluid and they wouldn't be as defined.
Then do you think that gender-based discrimination is more prevalent than race, national origin, religion, all that other kind of stuff?
I don't know that it's more prevalent. I think it's more subtle, right? So, that kind of thing that we talked about with how do you label people. Think about all of the not nice words. Think about, okay, you like to talk about President Trump. Think about the things that he said and did about Comey. He feminized him in his attack. That should be, if you think about the things that he said, he was basically calling him a girl, right? Yeah, he feminized him because women, in his eyes, are not as good as men.
Right, in his eyes, but is he the good example to utilize?
He's an example to utilize, right? Nobody's taking him to task, and that's on those issues.
Well, nobody's taking him to task because every day it's something else. They can't keep on track.
Well, and it's also very prevalent. It is very prevalent. Like I said, it's okay for a little girl to be a boy. It's not okay for a boy to take himself down in status to becoming a female.
Do you think that's why there is, whatever extent there is, of spousal abuse?
I think that's part of it. I think, well, because, I think a big part of spousal abuse comes out of watching Disney movies like Gaston. Look at the character of Gaston that kids today have been raised on. He's a horrible, horrible man. He really is. Look at the way he treats women. He pins them against the wall. He does all kinds of things. And the girls all, ah! You look at the Disney movies coming out of the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and only now starting to change. That little princess who's got to be saved by a man who's as abusive as they come. And they are. They're physically, emotionally, and spiritually abusive male characters. And we're raising our kids on those stereotypes. And Disney is finally starting to realize the influence that they've had. Now, part of that was actually intentional. If you look back at Legos in the 50s, you'll see an ad where the kids are standing at a table, boys and girls, and they're building things with the Legos together. You look at an ad today, and you're going to have boys building buildings and transformers and vehicles, and you're going to have girls making beauty shops and stores and little places for ponies to meet socially. You want to talk about genderizing, and why do they do it? Why do they do it? Not because they really believe there's this difference, although maybe they do after watching Disney, or their own ads over time, I don't know. But statistically, they can sell 40% more Legos to families who have a boy and a girl than they could have if both kids could use the same Lego set.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's deep.
Okay, so it's
wow.
Yeah, it's pretty profound. It really is. And some of that is this kind of subtlety of it's not even high enough for people to be aware. Look, and I'll the folks can't see your face, but when I was talking about Gaston, you had to think about it a minute. You had to really think about what that character does. It's so ingrained. It's okay for guys to be, boys will be boys, but let a girl be rough, and she's not ladylike, right? And what do we do with women? We put them in high heels, so you can't run well. We put them in short, tight skirts. You can't run well. Yeah, you don't do that with guys, right? Guys stay in fairly mobile clothes all the time. Women are put in these cute little princess outfits, and they're much less mobile. It's not an accident. It's not necessarily conscious. It's years and years and years, or generations, of building up this dichotomy. But it's not,
It's been like that for centuries.
No, it's changed. Less than 100 years ago, blue was the color appropriate for the fairer sex because pink was too intense, it being a diminutive of red, of course. Right? And you can look in the catalogs, you can look in the early Sears catalogs, and they talk about it that way. And then somewhere it flips. And now if you give a boy a pink bottle, you're going to turn him into a transgender. And it's like, that's nonsense. It's a pink cup. No big difference. And pink was considered too strong because it's related to red. And red's an intense color. Thomas Jefferson wore pink brocade. There are pictures of him in it. It was considered a manly color. And nowadays, people would go, ah. Right?
Huh.
So things have really changed. You look at Teddy Roosevelt. He's in a dress as a boy. Because especially wealthy boys were in dresses until they were well potty trained. But as long as you had to get under there and change a diaper, it was much easier to hike a skirt, change the diaper, and put the kid back out. Plus, dresses you don't outgrow them as fast. So lots of reasons to not put boys in pants. And it's only things like the zipper that makes it easier to get boys in and out and snaps. When you had to do the button hook things, it was much harder. And male clothes were more expensive.
Of course, in Catholic schools, we had corduroys.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to give you another subtle one. Here's one subtle one people don't even think about. Women's blouses close the other direction.
Yes.
Okay?
Yeah.
Which is harder for a person to do for themselves because women didn't dress themselves. They had ladies in waiting to dress them. And to make it easier for the person dressing them, the buttons went the other way.
Whoa.
Ooh, yeah. Okay. So there's all kinds of things to look back at how we have emasculated women, right? And that's not the right word, but depowered, disempowered. And, it's so subtle, it's so below the surface because we've grown up in it and we think it's okay. People get all upset about hijabs and covering like that. Look at a nun. They're just as covered. And nobody said that they were, were they being discriminated? Yeah, they are being discriminated against, but that's a much more subtle thing. So when somebody who's not from an American culture looks at America, they see our sexism. We don't see it because we're so used to it. And so many women have drunk that Kool-Aid. Just as some of the folks that are transgender or have different orientations also believe that they're somehow defective, even though they're not. They're just part of the human spectrum. As long as you're not hurting your partner, you're not defective. And if you're doing it consenting adults, then, what you do, you're doing as long as nobody's getting hurt. And that should be the bottom line, not any other frill or sidebar to it.
Okay, so that is not the type of thing that is most effectively dealt with by passing a law.
No, that's a sea change in the culture.
So how do you accomplish that?
Educating. Constantly educating and bombarding on it. It wasn't that many years ago that being gay or lesbian was considered mentally ill in the DSM. That, thank God, has changed. Conversion therapy is now, being outlawed, thank God.
Well, that was ridiculous.
Oh, absolutely. Let's teach you to not walk on two legs. Let's teach you to try to walk on three when you don't have them. That's just as logical. It's why don't you teach people to be healthy and happy and not hurt others? And let's leave it at that. I guess you could legislate that. Right? The Same-Sex Marriage Act is part of equal protection under the law. Right? That was the provision under which it was recognized by the Supreme Court.
You can pass laws and you can punish, but what you're talking about is so ingrained, as you say, subtly in society, that to change attitudes there, it's not just let's appoint a czar of education on this topic. It's not going to do anything. I don't know how you get an entire society to focus on such a subtle issue and recognize what is really happening.
Well, again, there are people who are educating on those things, and we need to bring some of that down into the schools because that's, and parents need to start taking some ownership. Don't let your kids watch a Disney movie with Gaston. I'm sorry. Pre-screen it. Look at it. There was a ton more violence until we learned that kids watching violence created violence, right? A kid who sees a human being aggress against another human being is so much more likely to be violently aggressive when they become an adult than somebody who's not exposed to that. There's tons and tons of research along those lines. And yet, on my iPhone, right, when I open up one of those little games that are on there when I'm killing a few minutes, One of the commercials that comes up is for some silly sniper program. Right? Let's teach kids to shoot people from the tops of buildings with high-power rifles. That's not the kind of thing that parents should allow their kids to have. And it's really got to...
But how many parents now are just using the television, say,
as a babysitter?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we actually have an even bigger problem. So I'm going to go into my psychology a little bit. We have a phenomena called screen kids. And what screen kids have, right? Because it's very easy to give a kid a tablet. And you put games, schools are using tablets. I teach with a tablet. I was watching, some of the other congregations that stream. You can see that the rabbi's using an iPad up on the bima. They got their service on there, and I know a number of rabbis who have who routinely do funerals on their tablets and just read it off of there, and that's useful and it's handy. And it's cheaper.
It's a teleprompter for all
intents and purposes. It's a teleprompter, and it's also, it takes the place of all the 3D physical toys. It's cheaper to buy an app on your tablet than it is to buy all the physical toys because they're so expensive now, and have been for a long time. But what's happening is that the kids can build something on the screen, but they don't know how to put one block on top of another. They're not building the eye-hand coordination and the spatial development that comes with building blocks or Legos or Lincoln Logs or American Brick or any of those building toys. I was an American Brick kid, and I still love Legos. So, although I buy generic sets and I don't buy the highly genderized on either side of it. Because I just like building things. But so it's going to take that kind of thing. So yeah, we need to get off the tablet as the babysitter. We need to get off the tablet as doing everything. On the other hand, is it useful? Yeah, if you've got to have the kid sitting there while you're waiting at the doctor's office, that's a good time for the kid to use the screen. When the kid comes home, get out the blocks. Require physical 3D play for some amount of time, or they will be lagging behind where they should be in spatial development. And so, yeah, and it's easy for me to say, but I work with kids so much. They really need serious parental input and teacher input to cause us to develop this front part of our brain so that we have the executive function that we need to have. We need to limit exposure to bad stereotypes and certainly to violence of any type, aggression. All of that dramatically builds things in our brains that kids don't need. And, front line of that's parents. Second line is teachers. Third line are, and I'll include myself as a teacher because a rabbi's a teacher. Right? And so I work really, really hard to not perpetuate some of the things that I think work counter to having the best society that we can have. And, do I take that as my passion? Absolutely. I think that's why God made me a rabbi, was to help teach people to get along and to recognize, Stuart mentioned it in the Ask a Lawyer. I do believe that we're all one people. We're all God's children. We're all approaching the same creator God. We understand that God perhaps differently, but it's not a different God. It's not their God, my God. That works fine if you're going to be playing some RPG thing and you want to have gods against gods. But then you're really using great, powerful things instead of God. And maybe you're really doing idolatry then. I don't know. That might be a really great discussion for another session. What's the idolatry? Because we have tons of idolatry in our lives. The things that we make idols of and we empower, right? Whether it's a rabbit's foot, like a rabbit foot's going to tell the creator what to do or not do. Hello. Right? We don't begin to really understand, I don't think, the total picture, but I think we get glimpses of it. And I think that when we see each other as children of God and we see the good in all, even if there's some amalgam and some spice in there that maybe isn't totally pleasant, but we get people to work on bringing out their best selves, that's when we're doing godly work. And that's when we'll achieve the kind of change that we talked about here, of what does it take to do the sea change so that people stop disempowering others as a cheap way to get an advantage, right? Because if you're not afraid that you won't get the job, you don't care who compete. If you're sure you're going to get the job that you deserve, you're not afraid of who's competing with you. Right? So, and back from the old women's libs days, I used to always say, I'm not afraid of men of quality because they're not afraid of women seeking equality. And, you know, and that really,
yeah.
And that's really the truth, right? Because it's only the folks on the fringe that are most terrified. The folks who are afraid that they won't get a job because there will be a better skilled woman to take that job, or, you know, or whatever, a better skilled Latino, a better skilled Oriental person, all of whom are Americans. Right? You know, I was the first in my family born in America. My parents were both born in Europe. Right? So they're really European, and I'm the American. They became Americans. They both were naturalized eventually. My father, not until I was a small child, a young child. So it took a while, and lots of reasons for all of those things. But I'm glad that he did it. I'm proud to be an American. I served in the U.S. military, and I would do it again. I believe in our country. I believe we can be a really good thing. And so that's been Ask a Rabbi here on WPSL on the Treasure Coast.
Well, and I hope you go to the YouTube page and watch this show again, because, what a message. You've been listening to Ask a Rabbi on WPSL, Port St. Lucie. The Talk of the Treasure Coast, webcaster to the world on Alexa and Google Home.